Okay, this is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. This is the Truth Attack Hour, and yes, that's right, folks. We're back with the Truth Attack. Okay, we are the Liberty Works Radio Network, and we do need the support of the members of the listening audience to keep the broadcast network operating. So, if you enjoy the information, the discussions, the lectures, the presentation of law, the guests and hosts on the other shows on the network, we sure would appreciate it if you could find your way over to the Liberty Works Radio Network.com website, if you're not already there listening online, and get signed up as a monthly subscribing member. Even if it's only $15, $20 a month, every supporting membership helps, and we do need your support to keep the network operating. And if you want to get fully informed on my favorite topic on this show, Thursday evenings at 6 o'clock, you'll find your way over, which is, of course, the maladministration of the federal income tax by the IRS, the DOJ, and the lower courts for the last 75 years since World War II. It's been a complete and total constitutional fraud. If you want to learn why and how it's coming to an end and why, find your way over to taxfreedom.com and start reading and get educated. And if you know anybody that needs help answering the IRS or the DOJ in court, you send them to irszoom.com, where I sell documents to help answer IRS administrative correspondence for $30, $40, and $50 a piece and no retainer, and where you can get documents to answer the DOJ in court from $75 up to, $250? So, if you need help in court or if you need help answering the IRS, head on over to the website, start reading, get in touch with me, and I'll help you. So, what do we got happening? Well, I guess the first story, of course, is the government shutdown is now going into, its fifth, sixth week. The Democrats just refuse to pass a clean, unpoliticized CR, continuing resolution, which is a reduced budget package that is passed temporarily to allow the government to continue paying bills and operating while the administration and Congress and the Senate work out what the budget is going to be. And for 40 years, this is how government's been doing it, because they haven't written a budget on time, except I think once. So a continuing resolution is a standard operating procedure, and it's not supposed to be politicized. You don't load the interim operating bill with political programs. Those are discussed and compromised on in the discussions that occur while the CR is in place to allow the government to operate. The Democrats refused to pass the bill. And a lot of people thought that once the election on Tuesday was over, the Democrats would then go ahead and pass the CAR. They wanted their voting base to be energized for Tuesday's elections. And they were, because Democrats pretty much swept the field, although that had to have been anticipated in blue states like New Jersey, Colorado, and purple states like Virginia and Georgia. And of course, in the ultra-blue New York City, Mamdani, the socialist, won the mayor's office 5 minutes after the polls closed, it was announced. We're going to talk about that in a bit. But the Democrats wanted the government closed. They've been the ones imposing the pain on America, yelling and screaming about affordability and high costs when it's their policies that caused all of that. All of the inflation that happened under Joe Biden is what drove the costs up. And while Trump has been successful in bringing inflation rate down to below right around 3% in the first 9 months, Biden couldn't do it in 4 years. Trump did it in 6 months. When the inflation rate comes down, prices don't come down with it all the way back to the same that they were before. The way the inflation rates come back to what it was before, just under 3%. The damage is done. Once you print the money and the prices go up, you'll get a little bit of it back because the increase in prices caused by energy cost increases have been diminished because energy prices are coming down with Trump's oil policy, keeping oil at $60 a barrel and promoting more energy production. Well, Biden did exactly the opposite. Tried to shut down energy, drove energy through the roof, and when you drive the price of energy through the roof, you increase the price of every product on every shelf in every store in every state in the country. It's inevitable. The products are distributed, and the last 50-mile leg is all diesel. And the first leg is all diesel, too, shipping containers or trains. So the inflation damage is done. The Democrats are yelling about affordability. They're the ones that caused the problem. It's their policies that caused the problem. Donald Trump is supposed to fix in 9 months what the Democrats took 4 years to destroy. Well, like I said, I'm sorry, the prices are never going back to what they were. That's not the way paper money works. I have a solution for restoring a sense of affordability to the American people, and I've been pushing it for 20 years. But let's talk right now for the moment. We're going to get back to that. I'll keep focused on the government shutdown. So what's the problem? Well, the problem is that in the Senate, they need 60 votes. Now, maybe 60 votes to pass a bill, to do a budget administration, or to pass this clean CR. They need 60 votes. And maybe when the Republican and the Democratic parties weren't so far apart from each other philosophically, and both was closer to the center, with the Democrats being just left center and the Republican being just right center, you had the possibility of getting that 60 votes because certain members of both parties would compromise with the other because they're both basically center and hoping to advance the interests of the American people. But today, that political reality is deteriorated. You have the Democrat Party, which is driven now by far-left extremism of the socialist wing. And the Republican Party has kind of become the populist center that used to be the center of both parties. That's why Trump won a landslide. The labor unions switched sides because they felt closer to the center right than the far left. Because first thing far left does is tax labor unions out of existence. They raise the tax on labor. That's where the money is. So the parties are now so far apart that it's not possible to get 60 votes because all the parties are completely partisan and vote the party line straight up and down. The proof, you want proof? Well, let's look at Abigail Spanberger, who just won in Virginia and has talked about being a moderate. But because she was employed at the CIA, which is typically perceived as a conservative organization, and she's pitched herself as being in the middle, a moderate Democrat like Manchin, one of the few left. But what do you see if you look at her voting record? Pure left. No aberration, no deviation whatsoever. She voted with Nancy Pelosi on absolutely every single extreme measure the Democrats could throw up. That's not representative of Virginia. That's party line politics, and it's not a it's not a center candidate, no matter what she says, no matter what people say about her, no matter how she talks on stage or in speeches. It's how you vote that tells what you really are. And her voting record says it's pure far left. So even the moderates won't vote in the middle for the good of the American people to keep the budget operating. And I think, it's been discussed, well, why don't you get rid of the 60-vote requirement? Just make it a simple majority, 51. Now, if you go down to 51, that means the Senate is no longer going to be a check and balance on a House that wants to move quickly. So there is an element of concern there in making it 50-50. But why don't we compromise? Since it is a 50-50 vote, why don't we say, well, if you can get 10% of the other party to support you, you can do it. So that would be 55. So instead of lowering the Senate majority count required to pass something to 50, or 51, a simple one-vote majority, we should lower it from 60 to 55. And the Senate Republicans could do that. They could lower it to 55. And I think you might get 3 Democrats to side with you. I think they already have the 55 count. So the solution there seems to be to get rid of the 60, because that 60 vote requirement is preventing the Congress from being able to pass law. Because the Senate votes party line to oppose any new law that the opposing party presents. So you can't get new law through the Senate. And this is a period of time where technology is moving incredibly fast. It is kind of important that the law keep up with the changing technology. And it isn't, because they can't pass the laws, because you can't get 60 votes. Because it's never about the one issue, it's always about 50 issues all packed into the one bill that they think they can get 60 votes for. And then when they can't, none of the issues get passed. All of these bills should be clean issue bills and take 55 in the Senate to pass the issue through, whatever it is. So that's kind of the solution to this log jam and hurdle that the Senate obviously can't get over. It's been stuck with this problem for 30 years. It's time to get rid of the 60 vote requirement, which cannot be met anymore unless somebody drops a nuclear bomb on us somewhere. So let's get rid of the 60, drop the number to 55, and get the government enabled to enact law to keep up with the current times, the changing technologies, and the wishes of the voters, who definitely gave Trump a mandate. He won every swing state. He won the Electoral College, the popular vote, the House of Representatives, the Senate, and the White House. That's a mandate, even in a 51 to 49% election. The majority was determined in the states. A majority of the states, a substantial majority, which is how we vote in this country, not a straight popular election, but a representative election state by state. You have to win the states, not just the majority of the people living on the dole, the government welfare, in the overcrowded cities, being maladministered by the Democrat Party, which is what typically happens. For some reason, the poor in this country vote Democrat, even though it's the Democrats that have been raping them since the Civil War, when it was the Democrats who became the Ku Klux Klan and opposed freeing the slaves and equal rights and civil rights and voting rights for the blacks in the South. Right through World War I, and Wilson, who restored segregation and racism against the black, and Roosevelt, who was a racist and originally proposed Social Security and only got it through the white vote in the South by excluding blacks. So it's the Democrat Party that's been the racist party for 150 years, not the Republicans. But for some reason, the poor and the majority of the blacks vote Democrat. I don't think they understand these things. I don't know what they're listening to. Other than, well, let's look at what happened in this just election, where the Democrats did a pretty good job of getting the message out about affordability, which appears to be what drove the vote in New York, if not in all the blue districts. I'm not sure. We'll look at that, but we're going to talk a little bit about that when we get back. I think I hear the first commercial break coming up. This is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. Find your way over to taxfreedom.com, get educated. Find your way over to libertyworksradionetwork.com, get signed up and help us keep broadcasting and restore liberty, freedom, and intelligence to America. Okay, this is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. This is the Truth Attack Hour, and I'm just going to get right back into it. When the commercial break came up, we were talking about how the Democratic Party is refusing to pass a clean CR, continuing resolution, to allow the government to fund things like food stamps, the SNAP program, military pay, and the pay of other federal employees, while a complete budget is negotiated and worked out between the parties during the interim time that the Clean CR provides for them to do that. And of course, I said before that the Democrats have been sitting on this just past election because they wanted to energize their base in opposing Donald Trump, which of course is the only policy the Democrats have. It's Trump derangement syndrome. That's the policy in the Democrat Party. They don't have any solutions for housing, the border, energy, crime, immigration, healthcare, nothing. They have solutions for nothing. The only policy they have is anti-Trump, anti-Trump, anti-Trump. Trump derangement syndrome. He's bad. Nancy Pelosi today was evidencing he's the vile, worst creature on the planet. Listen to this bitch. Good God. Yeah, he's a populist. And she can't deal with the center anymore. Oh my God. So anyway, the Democrats have been trying to energize their base by opposing Donald Trump for this past election, but that was the unspoken reason. They could never say that they were inflicting all that pain in order to get the socialist youth to go to the polls and vote blue in Virginia and New Jersey and New York City. What they were saying before the election as the reason for not fighting the CR was they wanted the Obamacare subsidies, which are due to expire in December, to be completely funded, $1.3 trillion. I think it's $350 billion, $1.3 trillion, to fund the Obamacare subsidies and to provide money for health care and taking care of illegal aliens, which is exactly why Trump got voted in. So they've shut down the government because they choose to care for illegal aliens, and they want Obamacare subsidies guaranteed by the CAR, which is a politicization of the continuing resolution. That's not the way it's done. Nobody's going to do that. They're absolutely insane. Now, Obamacare was a crime right from the beginning. It wasn't written as a tax, but the Supreme Court used judicial legislation to rewrite the law from a penalty to a tax in order to allow Obamacare's signature program, which was supposed to reduce healthcare costs, but it didn't. It's increased them for everyone all over the planet. It destroyed private insurance. It's put the insurance companies in charge of all insurance, making them gatekeepers to the doctors who take 30% of every healthcare dollar. How are you going to provide affordable healthcare when you got a gatekeeper taking 30%? It's the friggin' mafia. You can't provide health care through insurance companies. You do it through doctors and nurses and hospitals and clinics that are open to the public because they're staffed by doctors paid by the government in the U.S. Health Corps. No procedure costs, they just operate on the salary. That's the way you do medicine. Insurance companies don't provide health care, they provide profits for their shareholders. They give a crap if anybody gets health care. They could give a crap. So the Democrats wrote this bomb, and it is a bomb that would have already gone off in 2020 because that's when the subsidies ended. That's when the Obamacare subsidies actually ended, is in 2020. But COVID occurred, and they had to use COVID to immediately restore the subsidies. So there's more a big lousy program that's destroyed private insurance and raised the costs for everyone. It doesn't deliver health care to anyone. Is now why the Democrats don't want to open the government. They want the Obamacare subsidies that they wrote to load this time bomb to explode in 2020, which COVID pushed it out to now, 2025. And at the end of 2025, the whole Obamacare program blows up because it was never economically viable in the first place. It was always uneconomically viable. And that was basically proven when some 30 Republican states refused to set up exchanges, and the Supreme Court again rewrote the law for Obama and the Democrats, saying that, oh, a federal exchange was a state exchange. Oh my God. The law specifically says it has to be a state exchange. And the Supreme Court, Roberts, says, oh no, the Fed is a state. What? So now the federal government is given the constitutional authority to do everything that is specifically allocated in the Constitution? And everything else reserved to the states? Well, the Fed can do that too, because now they're one of the states. So there's no limitation on anything the federal government can do. Why are we surprised? There hasn't been a limitation on them since what? 1913 in the Federal Reserve Bank and the income tax? So Obamacare has 7% of the population. And the Democrats are shutting down the entire U.S. economy to save Obamacare for illegal aliens and foreigners and 7% of the population. That's all that's on Obamacare. And they want over $1 trillion to subsidize it. And that's the real reason why they kept the government closed. Because they don't think the Republican House and Senate are going to continue to subsidize Obamacare. Because when they passed it in 2010, not one single Republican voted for it. And I don't think many supported the subsidies until COVID. When if you didn't support government giving the money for COVID, well, government insisted it be shut down. Well, that's a pretty unreasonable position to hold. So anyway, 7% of the population on Obamacare, and Democrats want those subsidies restored and rewritten as part of the CR because they know they're not going to get it as part of the negotiations. And they shouldn't. So that energized youth in the Democratic Party, of course, is led by Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, and AOC. And now Mamdani, it's a socialist party. The Democrats have become a socialist party. I've been telling you this for, about 8 years, but it's becoming ever more evident. The whole party and its senior administrative leadership is being driven by concerns about the youth, the far left, the radical socialist, communist, obviously, wing of the Democratic Party that is taking over and co-opting the party from within the cities through the activism of the youth, who have never experienced socialism and have somehow been duped into believing the nonsense that everything in society and the cities can be free without consequence or expense to anyone. Which, of course, is la-la land, fantasy, delusional, a loss of a grasp on reality. There's only one way to restore a sense of affordability for the American people. And I've been telling you what it is for 25 years. There's only one way. The prices aren't coming down. They aren't coming back. The only way is to put more money in the pockets of the American worker. And you don't do that by raising the minimum wage, because all the product prices have to be raised too. If the company's got to pay more for labor, it's got to get more for the product. So you can't raise wages. So how do you give the people more money? You stop taking 30% in income tax. Terminate the income tax. 100% gone. It's been fraudulently and illegally and unconstitutionally enforced against the American people as a direct tax as a function of their working and earning a living in the 50 states. That's an unconstitutional tax. Terminate the withholding. Let the American people take home 100% of their paychecks. That's how you put more money in the pockets of the American people and make the price of life more affordable. There's no other way to do it. And socialism does exactly the opposite. It raises the taxes to fund the giveaways for the sloth, the lazy, the decrepit, and the absolutely dependent. That's how you put money and make back in the wallets of Americans and make life more affordable. You let them keep their whole paycheck. Stop stealing 30% of it and sending it to the Federal Reserve Bank. It's not even a tax system. It's a peonage debt system. The money from your paycheck doesn't go to the Treasury as required by law as collected tax. It goes around the Treasury to the Federal Reserve Bank. Don't believe me? Look at the back of the last check you sent to the IRS. See who cashed it, the Treasury or the FRB, Federal Reserve Bank. Don't believe me? How come on January 10th all the tax hasn't already been paid? It was collected. Your employer sent it in. Law says it's got to go in the Treasury. And there has to be a receipt accounting for the payment of the tax. So how come you have to pay if it's already been deposited in the Treasury as required by law? How come you got to file on April 15th? How come you got to pay tax? It's already been paid. If it ever existed as a tax. Which, of course, it didn't. The whole thing's a fraud. There's no tax imposed on your labor. There's just a system where you allow tax to be collected from your wages at work out of a misunderstanding and ignorance of the law. They're taking advantage of your ignorance of the law. You don't have to allow tax to be collected from you before it's legally due by law next April 15th. No one can force you to pay tax before it's due. That's involuntary servitude, to force you to service a tax before it's actually a legal obligation due and owing at the Treasury. No one can force you to do that. That's why they've had to dupe you about the W-4, which is an allowance certificate. It's not a notice of tax due. They have to have your permission on the allowance certificate. That's why they tell you on the first day, if you want to work here, you got to sign this. Why? Because your employer is a peonage debt overseer for the Federal Reserve Bank. He doesn't know it, but that's what he's doing by supporting the federal government's mandatory collection of tax from employees. The whole thing's a fraud. The whole thing's a fraud. 100% fraud. It's funding the wealthiest and richest elements of society, i.e. the Federal Reserve Bank, which is owed $38 trillion. And that's why your money is being sent to them. It's servicing that $38 trillion. It's got nothing to do with taxation, or funding the operation of the government. That's all done on debt. That's all done on debt. That's why it keeps going up $2 trillion a year. Surprise! There's no tax. You're a debt slave. The whole American population is a debt slave. And the youth think they're going to get more money from the socialists. Yeah, there's an awakening coming. It's called the brick wall. Okay, this is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. This is the Truth Attack Hour. We'll be back in 5 with more. Okay, this is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. This is the Truth Attack Hour, and we're just going to get back into this. You know, when we broke off here, I was talking about how if you want to have more affordability, it isn't going to come from prices going back down. The bad news is inflation doesn't go away the way the inflation rate does. The rate comes down, the prices don't come all the way back. You get some relief, but they're not coming back. The only way to create more affordability is to put more money into the pocket of the worker, and the only way to do that without causing prices to go back up again is to eliminate the federal income tax withholding from the paychecks, which was never supposed to be taxed. Your labor is not subject to any taxation under the Constitution. That's direct tax. When you tax labor, that's direct taxation, because you have to labor in order to be able to eat, or live, or dress, or shelter, or exist. You can't crawl into a cave and never interact. If anytime you barter, you owe some. This is slavery. It's wage slavery. There's no freedom in an income tax. That's why it's the second plank of the Communist Manifesto. It turns all the political and economic power over to the government bureaucracy to rule. Not to represent, but to rule and to enrich themselves, which is the history of humanity. When bureaucracies of government become so large that they become the law in and of themselves, which, of course, we've had for 50 years under Chevron, regulatory deference, or the bureaucracy of all these agencies that aren't constitutionally authorized, can write literally their own law through the regulations allegedly implementing the statutes, but often going far beyond what the statute authorizes. And of course, Loper-Bright took out Chevron regulatory deference, and this impacts income tax cases, almost all of them, because liability has been argued under regulations, not statute. And it's the regulations that implement the so-called direct tax under the 16th Amendment. You work, you owe. The regulations for Section 1 say you're liable, but the statute doesn't say that. Under regulatory deference, the courts have had to accept that Section 1 is where the liability for the direct tax under the 16th Amendment originates. But what happens when it turns out there is no direct tax? How does liability arise out of a function of working? Direct taxes are unavoidable. Indirect taxes can be avoided either by not engaging in the taxed activity or transaction. You abstain from buying alcohol, tobacco, firearms, or whatever the tax is. It's indirect and has to be collected from you when you make a purchase. Or it can be avoided through a shifting of the burden, because it's imposed as a collected tax where it's the collector who is actually made liable for the payment of the tax at the Treasury, and the collector, of course, never pays tax out of his own pocket. He just turns over what he has collected from other persons, the same way that a sales tax is indirect. Even though the store is the taxpayer with the statutory duty and liability to turn into the state treasury the collected tax, all of it, but the tax is never paid by the store out of its own pocket. It collects it from the customers at the cash register as transactions are conducted. So indirect taxes can be avoided and direct taxes cannot. And when you lay a tax on earnings and revenues derived from labor and work and the exercise of rights to private property and to work, you create an unavoidable tax that results in the unavoidable situation, or if you work, you owe, which is absurd. That's direct taxation, and those taxes cannot be enforced against individual persons. They can only be apportioned to the several states for enforcement of payment. And that's why they had to lie to you about the 16th Amendment allowing direct taxation without apportionment. No limitation. And they had to claim it was direct Because indirect taxation by impost, duty, and excise does not tax labor. Imposts tax foreign persons, foreign activity, and in foreign places, and foreign imports. Duties tax exported goods. Excises tax commodities, licenses, and the corporate privilege. The only way you could allege that labor was subject to indirect taxation is to try and argue that labor is a commodity, subject to tax by excise. But the labor unions saw them coming in 1935 when they passed Social Security. The labor unions went to Congress and had Congress pass Title 15, Section 17, which says the labor of a human being is not a commodity or article of commerce, and thus is removed, entirely removed from subjectivity to federal taxation by excise. It's not a commodity. It's certainly not a licensor or corporation. It's not an import or an export, and it's not a foreign person. Subject to the impost on labor that the original 1913 income tax law was when it was enacted as a tariff act, the Underwood-Simmons Tariff Act of October 3rd, 1913, requiring the collection of tax from non-resident alien persons, both individuals and corporations. And that's it. It was never a domestic tax. And Section 61 came 5 years later. Also, in foreign legislation, the Canadian Tax Treaty. It was enacted as Section 22 under the Canadian Tax Treaty, defining sources of taxable income in Canada by anyone operating there under the treaty between the years of 1918 and 1993. 75-year-long tax treaty that expired in 1993 was replaced by NAFTA with Bill Clinton, no more taxation, and then replaced since with the MCI, Mexico, Canadian, America, MCA. There's been a new treaty signed since then, but there's no taxation. Section 61 has expired. It was never domestic law. It's been a fraud all along. It's been fraudulently used as the basis for the direct tax, which was a fraud, under the 16th Amendment. They've been using gross income. If you earn money from any of these sources listed in Section 61 as gross income, well, then you're subject to a direct tax. Why did it have to be a direct tax? Because there's no indirect taxation of those sources. There's no impost, duty, or excise basis for taxing rent that your daughter pays renting a bedroom. That's by right. There's no indirect taxation of interest. Dividends, alimonies, commissions, tips, salaries, wages, none of that. None of those sources are subject to federal taxation in the 50 states. Only in the possessions and in foreign countries under tax treaty where the government has the authority to tax, not because of a territorial authority, but because of a legislative concession made by the foreign government, or because the government is the territorial authority in the possession, where the Constitution doesn't apply completely to everyone, especially with respect to this power to tax in the possessions. That doesn't apply as a power to tax in the states. It's indirect in the possessions, and you can't get to that indirect power in the states. That's why they've had to lie to you since World War II that it was a direct tax under the 16th Amendment. Oh, and here's the liability for the tax on the sources. So if you work, you owe, you slave. And the Supreme Court let them get away with it. The Supreme Court let them get away with it. Since Glenshaw Glass in 55, when they said gross income is the basis and Congress has power to tax all accessions to wealth, which they must be doing here in Section 61. The court missed the fact that Section 61 had just been recodified in 1954 from 22A and never had any domestic application. It was simply Canadian tax law being misinterpreted by the Supreme Court as domestic tax in order to sustain the direct taxation of the American people, which had been allowed since the victory tax in 1942. It's all a constitutional fraud. And this court has taken down the liberal decisions of that era. It's taken down abortion on Roe v. Wade with Dobbs. It's taken down the doctrine of regulatory deference under Chevron with Loper Bright. And now it's taken down the direct taxation of the American people's labor under the 16th Amendment with the Moore decision. So they've taken this all down. And when the direct alleged basis goes away, well, what's the basis for the tax as an indirect tax when it comes to taxing interest, dividends, rent, salaries, wages, annuities, tips, commissions? How are any of those sources taxable to the federal government in the 50 states? They're not. They're not. The whole tax has been a fraud. And it's allowed the corporations, the intended subject of the tax, to eliminate their burden and shift it entirely onto the backs of labor because the corporations get to deduct all of their expenses. 1,000 rents, 1,000 telephone bills, 200 cars, lunch every day for 50 executives. What happens if you deduct those things? Oh, disallowed. You owe tax on everything. There's no equal exchange of value in an hour of labor. It's 100% profit. Well, if that were true, it would mean there was no value to the labor. I didn't put anything in. If there's no value to the labor, wasn't the payment a gift? Who would pay me for something that was worthless? Over and over and over again. Hourly. Who would do that? Nobody. Obviously, there's value in the 1 hour of work. What's the value? 100% of the pay. Whatever hourly rate is negotiated. $8 for some people, 1,000 an hour for others, maybe more. Depends how good they are at what they do and what they do. Do you find oil in billion-dollar pools? Or do you crochet heating mitts? So, corporations don't pay. So you got to get rid of the income tax in its entirety, both on citizens and companies, because all it does is let the companies use accounting to get rid of the tax. Instead of taxing profits, you need to tax their revenues, and not at 20 to 40%, but at 5 to 10. Every dime of the company earned every month gets sent in 5 to 10%, and that becomes the monthly budget the government has to live within. Social Security has to be means tested, and health care is only provided by a network of providers who were paid on the government dime rather than profit-oriented. That means a U.S. health corps of hospitals, clinics, doctors, and nurses who, on scholarship, get through med school or nursing school and then serve 7, 5, or 3 years in the U.S. Health Corps, providing health care to the American people through a government network of hospitals and clinics, which is called the VA, which will no longer be staffed by bureaucrats, but will now be staffed by doctors and nurses who are held accountable for what happens inside the quasi-military U.S. Health Corps. No longer a VA bureaucracy run by people who could give a crap about the servicemen or medical care and are more concerned with record keeping than care. The system is a crime. It can easily be fixed. Staff it with doctors and nurses instead of bureaucrats. Make it about health care, not records. Means test Social Security and Medicare. Why is Donald Trump being offered Social Security? Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, they don't need the money. It's bribing. It's being used as a bribe to buy the votes of the old and elderly who are insecure. It's not legitimate spending. And Nancy Pelosi has announced she's retiring. To her, I say good riddance. Thank you.